Part 2. The Power of Attention and the Dis-ease of the World. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical instructions for bringing it about. William James, Principles of Psychology, 1890. Why paying attention is so supremely important. William James obviously didn't know about the practice of mindfulness when he penned the passage that I just recited, but I'm sure he would have been delighted to have discovered that there was indeed an education for improving the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again. For this is precisely what Buddhist practitioners have developed into a fine art over millennia based on the Buddha's original teachings. And this art is replete with practical instructions for bringing this kind of self-education about. While James was bemoaning the absence of something that already existed in that time, in a universe halfway round the world that was unavailable to him, the founder of modern American psychology nevertheless clearly put his finger on the magnitude of the problem. He understood how endemically the mind wanders, and how critically important it is to ride herd on one's own attention if one hopes to live fully a life of, as he put it, judgment, character, and will. For paying attention is something we do so selectively and haphazardly that we often don't see what's right in front of our eyes or even hear sounds that are carried to us through the air and are clearly entering our ears. The same can be said for all our other senses as well. Perhaps you've noticed it in yourself. It is easy to eat without tasting, miss the fragrance of the moist earth after a rain, even touch others without knowing the feelings we're transmitting. In fact, we refer to all of these ever so common instances of missing what is here to be sensed, whether they involve our eyes, our ears, or our other senses, as examples of being out of touch. We use touch as a metaphor for relating through all the senses because, in fact, we are literally touched by the world through all our senses, through our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and also through our mind. For all that, we tend to be specialists at being out of touch a great deal of the time, and out of touch with just how out of touch we can be. If we examine this phenomenon by simply observing our interior and exterior lives from time to time, it soon becomes quite apparent just how much of the time we are out of touch. We are out of touch with our feelings and perceptions, with our impulses and our emotions, with our thoughts, with what we are saying, and even with our bodies. This is mostly due to being perpetually preoccupied, lost in our minds, absorbed in our thoughts, obsessed with the past or the future, consumed with our plans and desires, diverted by our need to be entertained, driven by our expectations, fears, or cravings of the moment, however unconscious and habitual all this may be. And therefore, we can be, and usually are, amazingly out of touch in one way or another with the present moment, the moment that is actually presenting itself to us now. And our out-of-touchness is not limited to not seeing things that are right in front of us, or not hearing what is clearly coming to our ears, or missing out on the world of fragrance and taste and touch because we're so preoccupied and distracted. How many times have you unwittingly and improbably walked into the door you were opening, or inadvertently banged your hand or elbow on something, or dropped something you didn't know you were carrying because in that moment you weren't actually all there, and so were momentarily out of touch even with the spatial and temporal orientation of the body, which normally we have covered without too much specific attention. And is it not the case that we are sometimes equally and grossly out of touch with what we call the outside world, with our effects on other people, with what they care about and may be going through and feeling, even when it's written on their faces or apparent in their body language, if only we were available to ourselves to take notice. Yet the only way we can be in touch with any of this is through our senses. They are the only ways we have of knowing either the interior world of our own being or the outer landscape we call the world. We have more senses than we think. Intuition is a kind of sense. Proprioception, the body knowing how it is positioned in space, is a sense. Interoception, the overall interior feel of the body as a whole, is a sense. The mind itself can also be thought of as a sense, and indeed, as already noted, it is characterized as the sixth sense door in Buddhist teachings. For most of what we feel and know of both the inner landscape and the outer landscape completes itself through processing within the mind. Without mind, even our perfectly intact senses of eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin would not give us a very useful picture of the world we inhabit. We need to know what we are seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, and we know it only through the interaction between the sense itself and what we call mind, that mysterious knowing quality of sentience or consciousness that includes thought, but is not limited merely to thought. So we could accurately call awareness itself our sixth sense rather than mind. In a way, awareness and mind essence are two ways of saying the very same thing. Much of what we actually know, we know in a non-conceptual way. Thinking and memory come in a bit later, but very quickly on the heels of an initial moment of pure sense contact. Thinking and memory can easily color our original experience in ways that distort or detract from the bare experience itself. That is why painters so often prefer to feel their way into a new painting rather than to have it merely come out of the conceptual. The conceptual certainly has its place, but it often follows and only informs those raw feelings that move the senses to awaken in fresh and surprising ways. Bare perception is raw, elemental, vital, and thus creative, imaginative, and revealing. With our senses intact and by way of awareness itself, we can attend in such ways. To do so is to be more alive. Now, what shall we call this new form of gazing house that has opened in our town, where people sit quietly and pour out their glancing like light, like answering? Roomy, no room for form. In teaching about the importance of attention in health and well-being, I have found it useful and illuminating to feature a model first articulated by psychologist Gary Schwartz that emphasizes attention's pivotal role in health and disease. Consider the effects of not paying attention to what our bodies and minds are constantly telling us. For long stretches of time, of course, especially if we are fairly healthy to begin with, we can get away with not paying attention to anything, or at least it seems that way on the surface. But if various signs and symptoms, even subtle ones, are ignored, left unattended for too long, and if the condition you find yourself in is too much of a burden on the body or the mind, this disattention can lead to disconnection, the atrophying or disruption of specific pathways whose finely tuned integrity is necessary to maintain the dynamic process that underlies health. This disconnection can in turn lead to dysregulation, where things actually start to go wrong, swinging grossly away from the natural homeostatic balance. Dysregulation, in turn, can lead to outright disorder on the cellular, tissue, organ, or system level, a breakdown into dysregulated, chaotic processes. And this disorder, in turn, leads to or manifests as outright disease, or put otherwise, to dis-ease. We could take virtually any condition as a case in point, because the approach applies in any and all circumstances. But to keep it simple, let's take as an example not paying attention to, say, neck pain that might first appear as sensations of stiffness or muscle tightness. That would be the first sign or indication, especially if it persisted, of something that needed attending to, either in the form of seeing a doctor or beginning a physical therapy or yoga program, or both. Ignored, it might gradually become more frequent and severe, turning into a chronic complaint, a symptom perhaps of something deeper going on. By that time, we might have gotten kind of used to it, and if the pain is not too bad, and if we are very busy, we might just write it off to tension or stress and continue to ignore it. Over weeks, months, even years, if not attended to, such a condition will either go away on its own or tend to worsen, especially in response to stress, and it might make us more prone to injury, say if we turn our head too quickly while driving, or even lie in bed the wrong way. By that time, it may have become something of a syndrome that we have gotten so used to that we have learned to ignore it completely or tolerate it, perhaps denying the potential importance of doing something about it. This disconnection on our part can lead to a gradual dysregulation of the muscles and nerves in the neck in the form of chronic tension and even postural compensations that, in turn, can affect the bones and connective tissue over time to compound the condition. Things can get dysregulated to the point where our neck no longer functions normally, and the pain and discomfort and physical limitations in range of motion and posture worsen. This in turn can predispose us to inflammation in response to irritation or injury, a further disordering of things, followed perhaps by an increased likeliness of arthritis, a more serious disease condition that brings with it a great deal of dis-ease or discomfort. By the same token, we can say that attention, and in particular wise attention, not neurotic self-preoccupation and hypochondriasis, reestablishes and strengthens connection or connectedness. Connection, in turn, leads to greater regulation, which leads to a state of dynamic order, which is the signature of ease, of well-being, of health, as opposed to dis-ease. And for this to take place, of course, attention has to be maintained and nourished by intention. So attention and intention together play an intimate role in supporting each other, the yin and the yang, if you will, underlying health and healing, as well as clarity and compassion. In the previous example, paying attention might involve taking care of our neck by going to a yoga class, or getting a good massage from time to time. We're training ourselves to notice how stress and tension can accumulate in the neck at particular times, and how even our awareness of it can itself influence and perhaps minimize those occurrences. We literally and metaphorically become more in touch with the neck, what it's up to, and what it's capable of. This connectivity leads to greater regulation, as the neck responds to our attention. Continued attention to the body's messages might be furthered additionally by taking an MBSR program to learn how to deal with accumulated tension in our life so it doesn't always wind up in our neck, literally becoming a pain in the neck. Perhaps learning something as simple as bringing greater mindfulness to the sensations in the neck so that we are in touch with those early warning signs and symptoms and can recognize them rather than ignore them, and perhaps learn how to let the breath dispel some of the accumulated tension. In this way, the concatenation of circumstances predisposing us to a worsening of the condition may be nipped in the bud, and we continue to experience increasing order and ease and an absence of neck pain even under stress rather than ever-increasing neck problems. However, it is always possible when we pay close attention to something that we will at times fall unwittingly into misperception when, for whatever reason, we do not see clearly what is unfolding in a particular moment, and thereby miss the real connection and the chain leading up from attention to greater connection and ultimately to ease and thus to health, clarity, even a degree of wisdom in relationship to the neck, and compassion in being more kind to yourself and your neck. That moment of misperception can itself, if unattended to, lead to a misapprehension, a misappraisal of a situation or circumstance, and from there to a possible misattribution of its particular cause. That in turn can lead to an outright and literal mistake, a mistaking of what we think to be true for the actuality of how things are, followed by acting on that causal chain from misperception to misapprehension to misappraisal to misattribution to mistake. It happens in our daily lives in those moments when we actually make mistakes, mistakes usually caused by misperception and misattribution. If unexamined, this can be a parallel route to dis-ease, psychologically, socially, and physically. In our example of the neck pain, a misperception might take the form of an obsessive preoccupation with fleeting sensations in the neck that we might exaggerate into pain, making a mountain out of a molehill, so to speak, leading to hypochondriasis and maybe even wearing a neck brace unnecessarily while not exercising the neck in ways that could make it stronger and more flexible. We might be walking around identifying with what we tell ourselves is a chronic neck problem and missing all opportunities for looking more deeply into it. We could call this a form of unwise attention, rooted in a reactive self-preoccupation that keeps us stuck in disconnection of a different order. Such unwise attention also drives things all too frequently at the level of the body politic, when people are stampeding into formulating new policies or making decisions on the basis of wrong, incomplete, or misanalyzed information, or driven by underlying motives often unexamined, which put personal self-interest above the wisdom of considering the well-being of the whole and how to further it. The consequences of such misperceptions and mistakes can be non-trivial, resulting in missed opportunities of all sorts. Often such mistakes can lead unnecessarily to the inflaming of already incendiary situations that could have been perceived more accurately in the first place, were the lenses of perception and their state of clarity or lack of clarity objects of attention at the beginning. For such reasons, accurate perception and correct apprehension are key elements in our ability to come to our senses, both literally and metaphorically. When through the practice of mindfulness we learn to listen to the body through all its sense doors, as well as to attend to the flow of our thoughts and feelings, we are beginning the process of reestablishing and strengthening connectedness within our own inner landscape. That attention nurtures a familiarity and an intimacy with our lives unfolding at the level of what we call body and what we call mind, that deepens and strengthens well-being and a sense of ease in our relationship to whatever is unfolding in our lives from moment to moment. We thus move from dis-ease, including outright disease, to greater ease and harmony and, as we shall see, greater health. And this is as true, as we shall come to examine further on, for our institutions and for the body politic, as it is for the body and for our individual minds. Dis-ease. Consume my heart away. Sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, it knows not what it is. W.B. Yeats, Sailing to Byzantium. With regard to disease and dis-ease, we might say that the most fundamental dis-ease, stemming from disattention and disconnection, and from misperception and misattribution, is the anguish of the human condition itself, of the full catastrophe, unmet and unexamined. As suggested by the opening sentence of our meditation brochure for business leaders, which speaks of the unexamined whispered longings of the heart, virtually everybody has to some degree or other whispered longings from deep within the psyche, a secret life really, a life full of dreams and possibilities we usually keep hidden. The sad thing is, we usually keep it hidden from ourselves, too. We suffer greatly as a consequence. The secret is sustained often for the whole of our lives with no inkling that we are complicit in a self-deception that can be severely life-eroding and self-destructive. The real secret? That we really do not know who or what we are, for all the surface preoccupations, pretensions, and the inward and outward posturing we construct and hide behind to keep ourselves and everybody else in the dark. For are not our hearts at various times filled with, driven, even tormented by unsatisfied and seemingly endless desires, great and small, no matter how outwardly successful and comfortable we may appear to be? And are we not vaguely aware on some subterranean level of the psyche that we are indeed fastened to a dying animal, and that we do not know who and what we actually are? In 3 lines, Yeats captured 3 fundamental aspects of the human condition. 1, that we are unfulfilled and suffer for it. 2, that we are subject to sickness, old age, and death, the inexorable law of impermanence and constant change. And 3, that we are ignorant of the true nature of our very being. Isn't it time for us to discover that we are already larger than we allow ourselves to know? Isn't it time for us to discover that it is possible to inhabit that larger knowing and perhaps free ourselves from the deep anguish of our persistent habit of ignoring what is most important? I would argue that it is long past time, and that now is also the perfect time. True, we may feel at times intimations of our discomfort in vague stirrings within the psyche. Once in a rare while, we may even catch momentary glimpses of it, waking up disoriented and frightened in the middle of the night, or when someone close to us suffers deeply or dies, or our own life's framework suddenly unravels as if it had always been primarily, in some strange way, merely imagined. But then, isn't it true that as soon as possible, we go back to sleep, literally and metaphorically, and anesthetize ourselves with one diversion or another? This primordial human dis-ease of which Yeats speaks, that we know not what we are, feels too huge to bear. Thus, we bury it deep within the psyche, secreted away, well sequestered from daylight consciousness. Often, as we've seen, it takes an acute crisis to awaken us to it, and to the possibilities of true healing and freeing ourselves from the darkness of our fear and our ignoring. We suffer greatly in body and mind from this turning away from these deepest intimations of our humanity. We may feel consumed, to use Yeats' word, literally eaten up, and also diminished in countless ways because we neglect the full reality of what we are. Yet we might not know that with any clarity or conviction either. This dis-ease of unawareness, of ignoring what is most fundamental in our own nature as beings, affects our lives as individuals virtually from moment to moment and over the course of decades. It can produce short and long-term effects on our health of both body and mind. It cannot help but color family life and work life in ways that often remain unseen or that are not discovered until years after a certain kind of damage has been done and unwise roads unwittingly pursued. And its presence spills out to influence society through our collective ways of seeing ourselves and of doing business. It pervades our institutions and the way we shape or ignore our inner and outer environments. Everything we do is colored in one way or another by our ignoring the malaise of not knowing who we are and how we are. It is the ultimate affliction, the ultimate disease. And as such, it gives rise to many variants, to many different manifestations of anguish and suffering at the level of the body, the mind, and the world. Dukkha. Buddhists have a remarkable and extremely useful word for the dis-ease stemming from being filled with desire, fastened to a dying animal, and not knowing what we are. They call it dukkha, a Pali word in the language in which the Buddha's teachings were first written down. The meaning of dukkha is exceedingly difficult to capture in one English word. It is rendered variously by translators and scholars as suffering, anguish, stress, malaise, dis-ease, or unsatisfactoriness. The first noble truth of the Buddha's teachings is the centrality, universality, and unavoidability of dukkha. the innate suffering of dis-ease that invariably, in subtle or not subtle at all ways, colors and conditions the deep structure of our very lives. All Buddhist meditative practices revolve around the recognition of dukkha, the identification of its root causes, and the description, development, and deployment of pathways whereby we might each become free from its oppressive, blinding, and imprisoning influences. These pathways to freedom from suffering, from dukkha, are all one pathway really, a method aimed at awakening us to what we have been keeping secret or hidden from ourselves. How? By paying wise attention to whatever arises in our experience instead of what we usually tend to do, which is either to not pay attention to it at all, or alternatively to wallow in it, romanticize it, quietly and hopelessly endure it, struggle against it, downright drown in it, or endlessly distract ourselves to escape from it. Such a pathway offers the possibility of leading a far more satisfying and authentic life. So the truth of the universality of dukkha is actually not some maudlin and passive bemoaning of its inevitability, precisely because this dissatisfaction and sometimes anguish is neither enduring nor intrinsically limiting. It can be worked with, even in its most horrific aspects. It can become our teacher. It can serve to show us how we can free ourselves from its grasp. And importantly, our exploration of the possibility of liberation from suffering, from dukkha, and the living of a more authentic and satisfying life is not undertaken merely for ourselves, although that in itself would be quite an accomplishment and may be the proximal motivation that brings us to mindfulness practice. But in very real and non-romantic ways, it's also for the benefit of all beings with whom our lives are inexorably entwined. It turns out that that's a lot of beings. The whole universe, really. Lying at the heart of all these meditative practices for the recognition of, liberation from, and cessation of dukkha is the cultivation of mindfulness, an entirely different way of relating to this pervasive condition of dis-ease, one that involves embracing it and being willing to work with it, to observe it without bias in its most intimate characteristics. As we've said, mindfulness can be thought of as an open-hearted, non-judgmental present-moment awareness, that direct, non-conceptual knowing of experience as it unfolds, in its arising, in its momentary lingering, and in its passing away. Addressing those dedicated to the embodiment of his teachings through intensive and systematic practice, the Buddha said, "This is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and grief, for the attainment of the true way, for the realization of liberation, namely the 4 foundations of mindfulness." Quite an assertion. All of Buddhism is oriented toward waking up from the delusions we spin for ourselves and the ones we are conditioned into through past experiences. In awakening, we free ourselves from the suffering and anguish that come from mistaking the nature of reality through our limited self-oriented views and tendency to grasp and cling to what we desire and to push away what we fear. In the past 2,600 years, the various meditative traditions within Buddhism have developed, explored, and refined a range of highly sophisticated and effective methods for the cultivation of mindfulness and of the wisdom and compassion that emerge naturally from its practice. There are many doors into the room of mindfulness. While the view from each one might be quite different in some respects, the important thing is to enter the room. The door to choose is the one that is most congenial to you, or the most convenient, for whatever reason. But above all, the invitation is to enter, 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 rather than stand in the doorway and comment about it. Just as it has been argued by Thomas Cahill that the Irish saved Western civilization by the copying of ancient manuscripts by monastics during the Middle Ages in Europe, and the gift of the Jews was to give the world its first articulation of historical time unfolding and therefore a sense of the possibility of the development of the individual within time in personal connection with the numinous, so we could say that the historical figure of the Buddha and those who have followed his lead gave the world a well-defined algorithm, a path of inquiry, which he himself pursued in search of what was most fundamental to the nature of humanity, the possibility of being fully conscious, fully awake, and free from the fetters of our own conditioning, including our unexamined habits of thought and perception and the afflictive emotions that so intimately and frequently accompany them unbidden. Dukkha magnets. Consider this. Whether you want to call it stress or dis-ease or dukkha, it's pretty obvious that hospitals function as major dukkha magnets in our society. Their force fields pull in those among us who are suffering the most in any given moment, either from disease or dis-ease or both, from stress, pain, trauma, and illness of all kinds. People go or are taken to the hospital when there is literally nowhere else to go, when they have run out of other options and resources. As a rule, hospitals are not places we go to have fun or to be entertained or enlightened, but they are very much the places we go when we seek to be treated and hopefully repaired and fixed, we say fixed up, if not cured. We go with the expectation that we will be met, and met adequately, met appropriately, and that we will be tended to with care and attention. And if we are very fortunate, perhaps enlightened as to what is going on with us and what we need to do. Given the level of suffering hospitals attract, one might think, what better place to offer training in mindfulness, said by no less an authority than the Buddha himself, to be the direct path for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, and the disappearance of pain and grief, in a word, the relief of suffering. Might not some exposure to mindfulness, if it is indeed as powerful and as fundamental and as universal as the Buddha was claiming, be of significant benefit to many of the people who walk or are carried through its doors? Of course, such an offering would be available not as a substitute for good and compassionate medical care, but as a potentially vital complement to whatever treatments they might be receiving. And what better place to offer such training, not only for the patients, but for the staff as well, who in many instances are just as stressed as the patients. This is how mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, came to be born. At first, it was offered primarily for those medical patients who could be said to be falling through the cracks of the healthcare system, people who were not being completely helped by the medical treatments available to them. That turned out to be a lot of people. It also included a great many people who had not improved with traditional medical treatment or were suffering from intractable conditions for which medicine has few options and no cures. And we were happy to be able to offer them an opportunity to explore the boundaries of the possible for themselves. However, the program soon attracted an even broader spectrum of patients within the hospital. After all, stress reduction has an innate appeal. The most universal response to the signs in the corridors pointing to stress reduction is, "I could use that," followed by, of course, in many cases, "but I don't have any time for it." But at this juncture, almost 40 years after it started, more and more patients and even more physicians are realizing that they may not be able to afford not to take the program and begin paying more careful attention to what has for so long been unattended. From its inception, MBSR gave physicians across a wide range of disciplines and specialties a new option for their patients. The Stress Reduction Clinic was a place within the hospital where medical patients could, on an outpatient basis, learn to do something for themselves as a complement to all the treatments and procedures that were being done for or to them. Something potentially extremely powerful and also hard to come by, precious. In parallel, the option to refer their patients to MBSR also gave physicians a way to relieve their own stress stemming from the patients for whom they no longer had good treatment options, but who kept coming back with their complaints and in many cases were majorly dissatisfied with their treatments or lack of them. Now there was a place to send them within the hospital where, within a highly structured, supportive, and emotionally safe environment, they could be invited to take on a higher degree of responsibility for their own experience and the states of mind and body they were experiencing and suffering from, however painful, problematic, or chronic those conditions were. A program that would offer them and guide them in the possibility of tapping into hitherto unknown but very deep and universal inner resources at their disposal for learning, growing, healing, and transformation, not just for the 8 weeks that they were in the program, but hopefully for the rest of their lives. In the process, people who had felt to a large degree like passive recipients of healthcare would have an opportunity to become full participants and vital partners in their own ongoing healthcare and well-being. And they would be able to undergo such a process while being fully seen and met and held in high regard by the class instructor simply for being human and for being who they were and for what they had been through. Moreover, they would be nested within and embraced by the emergent community of goodwill and kindness, what Buddhists call Sangha, that seems to arise spontaneously when people practice mindfulness together. That was the vision underlying what we came to think of more and more as a participatory medicine, one that involved recruiting the interior resources of the patient as a vital complement to whatever medical or surgical treatments they were also receiving. And since the words medicine and meditation actually share the same root meaning, it didn't seem as far-fetched a juxtaposition for a medical center and a school of medicine to be offering meditation to their patients as some might imagine, even back in 1979 when MBSR began. Both medicine and meditation come from the Latin medere, which means to cure. However, the deep Indo-European root of medere carries the core meaning of to measure. This is not our usual notion of measure as an accounting of the quantitative relationship to an established standard for a particular property such as length, volume, or area. Rather, it refers to the Platonic notion that all things have their own right inward measure, the properties or isness that make the object what it is. Medicine can be understood as that which restores right inward measure when it is disturbed, and meditation as the direct perception of right inward measure and the deep experiential knowing of its nature. Hospitals are not the only dukkha magnets in our society, only the most obvious. Prisons are also dukkha magnets, the destination of too many lives shaped by dukkha and thus primed for perpetrating continual and untold suffering on others and on themselves. Happily, mindfulness programs are increasingly being offered in prisons. Then again, many of our institutions, such as schools and work sites, produce or attract their own particular brands of dukkha, and mindfulness-based programs of one kind or another are, of necessity, being brought into those domains with increasing frequency and quality as well. When it comes right down to it, dukkha is, as the Buddha taught, ubiquitous, a fact of life. It is not that life is suffering, a widespread misinterpretation of the First Noble Truth. It is that there is the actuality of suffering, and it needs to be recognized and taken into account in order to be free from it. The only way out, as Helen Keller wisely observed, is through. The only way through is by recognizing dukkha when it appears and coming to know its nature intimately, moment by moment. Dharma. The quality of our relationship to experience and the multiple landscapes, both inner and outer, within which it unfolds, starts obviously with ourselves. For example, if we have a desire for the world to be more peaceful, can we take a good look and see if we can be at all peaceful ourselves? Are we prepared to notice how much of the time we may not be so peaceful and what that's all about? Can we notice how bellicose we can be at times, how belligerent, how self-centered and self-serving in the microcosm of our own life and mind? If we desire others to see more clearly, can we start by paying attention to how we see things ourselves, and whether we can actually perceive, apprehend, and understand what is actually happening in any moment without prejudging or prejudice? And are we willing to admit to ourselves how difficult that can be, as well as how important? If we wish to know something of who we are, in the spirit of Socrates' injunction to know thyself, and Yeats' assertion that we don't, there is no way around the need to look deeply into ourselves. If we wish to change the world, perhaps we might do well to tackle change in ourselves alongside change in the world, even and especially in the face of our own resistance and reluctance and blindness to change, even and especially as we're being confronted with the law of impermanence and the inevitability of change, conditions we are subject to as individuals, regardless of how much we resist or protest or try to control outcomes. If we wish to make a quantum leap to greater awareness, there's no getting around the need for us to be willing to wake up and to care deeply about waking up. In the same vein, if we wish for greater wisdom and kindness in the world, perhaps we could start by learning to inhabit our own body a bit more with some degree of kindness and wisdom, even for one moment, just accepting ourselves as we are with kindness and compassion, rather than forcing ourselves to conform to some impossible ideal. The world would immediately be different. If we wish to make a true difference in the world, perhaps we must first learn how to stand in relationship to our own lives and our own knowing, or at least learn along the way, which always amounts to the same thing, since the world does not wait for us, but is unfolding along with us in intimate reciprocity. And if we wish to grow or change or heal in any way, perhaps to be less strident or acquisitive or more confident or generous, perhaps we must first taste silence and stillness, and know that drinking deeply at their wells is itself healing and transformative through embracing in awareness itself whatever we find here in this moment, including our most deeply ingrained and unconscious tendencies. All this has been known for centuries, but liberative practices such as meditation were for the most part sequestered for all those centuries in monasteries under the stewardship of diverse cultural and religious traditions. For various reasons, including the vast distances lying between them geographically and culturally, and because of the distance between themselves as renunciates of the secular world and that world, these monasteries tended to be isolated, sometimes secretive about their practices, and perhaps in some cases parochial and exclusive rather than universal, at least until now. Now, in this era, everything that has ever been discovered by human beings is out there for our investigation as it has never been before. In particular, Buddhist meditation and its associated wisdom tradition, known variously as Buddha Dharma or simply the Dharma, is available to us now as never before and is touching the lives of millions of Americans and other Westerners in ways that would have been unimaginable 40 or 50 years ago. What the Buddhists call the Dharma is an ancient force in this world, much like the Gospels, except that it has nothing to do in essence with religious conversion or with organized religion for that matter, or even with Buddhism per se, if one wants to think of Buddhism as a religion at all. But like the Gospels, it is literally good news. The very word Dharma, which means variously the teachings of the Buddha, the lawfulness of the universe, and the way things are, has found its way into our language in the past century through Jack Kerouac's famous characterization of himself and his beat friends as Dharma bums, through the poet Allen Ginsberg's appellation of Dharma lion, and through the marketing of it for a time as a novel woman's name in a television show displayed prominently in subway stations and on the sides of buses, as so often happens in America. The Dharma was originally articulated by the Buddha in what he referred to as the Four Noble Truths. He elaborated on this foundational teaching throughout his lifetime. It continues to be passed down and elaborated on to this day in unbroken lineages and streams within all the various Buddhist traditions. In some ways, it is appropriate to characterize Dharma as resembling scientific knowledge, ever-growing, ever-changing, yet with a core body of methods, observations, and natural laws distilled from thousands of years of inner exploration through highly disciplined self-observation and self-inquiry, a careful and precise recording and mapping of experiences encountered in investigating the nature of the mind, and direct empirical testing and confirming of the results. However, the lawfulness of the Dharma is such that, in order for it to be Dharma, it cannot possibly be exclusively Buddhist any more than the law of gravity is English because of Newton, or Italian because of Galileo, or the laws of thermodynamics Austrian because of Boltzmann. The contributions of these and other scientists who discovered and described natural laws always transcend their particular cultures because they concern nature pure and simple, and nature is one seamless and ultimately deeply mysterious whole, a wholeness that we ourselves are not outside of, but rather very much nested within. The Buddha's elaboration of the lawfulness of the Dharma transcends his particular time and culture of origin in the same way, even though a religion grew out of it, albeit a peculiar one from the Western point of view, as it is not based on worshipping a supreme deity. Mindfulness and Dharma are best thought of as universal descriptions of the functioning of the human mind and heart regarding the quality of one's attention in relationship to the experience of suffering and the potential for well-being, eudaimonia, following Aristotle, and wisdom. They apply equally wherever there are human minds, just as the laws of physics apply equally everywhere in our universe, as far as we know, or Noam Chomsky's universal generative grammar is applicable across all languages in the elaboration of human speech. And from the point of view of its universality, it is helpful to recall that the Buddha himself was not a Buddhist. He was a healer and a revolutionary, albeit a quiet and inward one. He diagnosed our collective human dis-ease and prescribed a benevolent medicine for sanity and well-being. Given this, one might say that in order for Buddhism to be maximally effective as a Dharma vehicle at this stage in the evolution of the planet, and for its sorely needed medicine to be maximally effective, it may have to give up being Buddhism in any formal religious sense, or at least give up any attachment to it in name or form. Since Dharma is ultimately about non-duality, distinctions between Buddha Dharma and universal Dharma, or between Buddhists and non-Buddhists, cannot be fundamental. From this perspective, the particular traditions and forms in which it manifests are alive and vibrant, multiple and continually evolving. At the same time, the essence remains, as always, formless, limitless, and one without distinction. In fact, even the word Buddhism is not Buddhist in origin. Apparently, it was coined by European ethnologists, philologists, and religious scholars in the 17th and 18th centuries who were trying to fathom from the outside, through their own religious and cultural lenses and tacit assumptions, an exotic world that was largely opaque to them. For more than 2,000 years, those who practiced the teachings of the Buddha in whatever lineage, and there were many lineages, even within individual countries, all holding somewhat different interpretations of the original teachings, apparently simply referred to themselves as followers of the way or followers of the Dharma. They did not describe themselves as Buddhists. Coming back to Dharma as the teachings of the Buddha, the first of the Four Noble Truths he articulated after his intensive inquiry into the nature of mind was the universal prevalence of dukkha, the fundamental dis-ease of the human condition. The second was the cause of dukkha, which the Buddha attributed directly to attachment, clinging, and unexamined desire. The third was the assertion, based on his experience as the experimenter in the laboratory of his own meditation practice, that cessation of dukkha is possible. In other words, that it is possible to be completely cured of the dis-ease caused by attachment and clinging. And the fourth Noble Truth outlines a systematic approach known as the Noble Eightfold Path to the cessation of dukkha, the dispelling of ignorance, and thus to liberation. The four taken together actually reflect an ancient medical perspective that is still very much in use today. Diagnosis, which is the first Noble Truth, etiology, second Noble Truth, prognosis, third Noble Truth, and treatment plan, fourth Noble Truth. The prognosis is stated as very positive, namely that liberation from suffering and greed, hatred, and delusion is possible, and the treatment plan outlines the recommended approach. Mindfulness is one of the 8 practice elements of the Eightfold Path, the one unifying and informing all the others. Altogether, the 8 practices are wise or right view, wise thinking, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. Each contains all the others. They are different aspects of one seamless whole. Thich Nhat Hanh puts it this way: when right mindfulness is present, the Four Noble Truths and the 7 other elements of the Eightfold Path are also present. The Stress Reduction Clinic and MBSR. Harking back to dukkha and dis-ease, if I hadn't known it before, simply from my own meditation practice and observing my own incessant tendencies to go unconscious and be caught up and completely entangled in the turbulence of the thinking mind and reactive emotions, working in a stress reduction clinic soon confirmed how widespread the dis-ease of unawareness really is, and how hungry we are to set it right, how starved we are for a consistent, authentic, wholehearted experiencing of being alive, of being undivided, how starved we are for peace of mind, and how desirous of finding some relief from what often seems like a treadmill of endless physical and emotional pain. All these and countless other faces of dukkha would arise in conversation with people who came for intake interviews before joining the program. I would merely ask as an opener, what brings you to stress reduction, and then keep quiet and listen. If the person feels met, seen, or accepted as he or she is, such a question invites speaking from the heart. It carries the felt recognition and acknowledgement that there may be limitless depths to one's suffering, or at least that it can feel that way. I learned from this listening that our patients came to the stress reduction clinic for a lot of different reasons that, in the end, were really just one reason: to be whole again, to recapture a spark they once felt they had, or felt they never had but always wanted. They came because they wanted to learn how to relax, how to relieve some of their stress, how to lessen physical pain, or learn to live better with it, how to find peace of mind and recover a sense of well-being. They came because they wanted to take charge in their lives and get off of their pain medication or their anti-anxiety medication, and not be, as they often said, so nervous and uptight. People came to the clinic because they had been diagnosed with heart disease or cancer or chronic pain conditions or a host of other medical problems that were having an untoward influence on their lives and their freedom to pursue their dreams. They came because they were finally open, often out of desperation, to doing something about it for themselves, something that no one else on the planet could do for them, including their doctors, namely take charge in their lives and do what they could on their own as a vital complement to whatever traditional allopathic medicine was able to offer, in the hope of getting stronger, healthier, somehow perhaps also wiser, inwardly and outwardly. They came because aspects of their lives or their bodies or both weren't working for them anymore, and because they knew that medicine could only do so much for them and that it wasn't going to be enough, had not been enough up to now. They came because their doctors conferred a legitimacy on squarely naming and facing up to the stress and pain in their lives and doing something about it simply by referring them to us. They came because our clinic was right there in the hospital, and therefore mindfulness and stress reduction, meditation, yoga, and all the interior work they would be invited to engage in, much of it in silence, could be seen as an integral part of mainstream medicine and healthcare, and thus as legitimate approaches for dealing with their problems. And perhaps above all, they came and stayed because we somehow managed to create an atmosphere in the room that invited a deep and open-hearted listening, an atmosphere that the patients could recognize immediately as benign, empathic, respectful, and accepting. That kind of feeling tone, unfortunately, can be an all too rare experience in a busy medical center. Because we gave everybody plenty of time to respond to that one question, what brings you here, most were willing, even happy, to speak honestly and openly, often with great poignancy, of their malaise and dis-ease, of feeling lost or overwhelmed, victimized or in some way lacking, far beyond the cancer diagnosis or pain condition or heart problem listed as the primary diagnosis and reason for the referral. Their stories frequently revealed the poignant suffering of the heart that accompanies not being seen or honored by others in childhood, and of coming to adulthood without feeling their own goodness or beauty or worthiness. And of course, they spoke movingly of the suffering of the body, from chronic back pain, neck pain, face pain, leg pain, many different forms of cancer, HIV and AIDS, heart disease, and a myriad of somatic maladies, compounded in many cases by the suffering of the mind from chronic anxiety and panic, from depression and disappointment, from grief, confusion, exhaustion, chronic irritability and tension, and a host of sometimes overwhelmingly afflictive emotional states. The good news, as people going through the MBSR program have discovered for themselves time and again over the years, and as documented in an ever-increasing number of medical studies, not just from our own clinic, but from mindfulness-based programs in hospitals and clinics around the world, is that each and every one of us can have a hand, finally, in facing and embracing the fullness of what we are as human beings, in affirming that whoever we are, it is possible to wake up to what is hidden and opaque, frightened and frightening in us that shapes our lives whether we know it or not, and to awaken as well to other, healthier, saner longings that call to us from the depths of our own hearts and let them flower in our lives in ways that are restorative and healing, and in many cases, dramatically symptom-reducing. My colleagues and I in MBSR clinics around the country and around the world have seen this happen for countless people suffering with unthinkable levels of stress, pain, illness, and unimaginable life circumstances and histories, from the full catastrophe, the full spectrum poignancy of the human condition itself, in all its rending and unending complex urgency and specificity. Whether big or little, gross or subtle, the degree of transformation that can take place in people over a relatively short period of time never ceases to astonish me. I can sometimes see it unfolding in myself as well, when my senses don't take leave of me or I of them. And amazingly, at times I can even manage to catch the taking leave when it does occur, and thereby restore a measure of momentary or even sustained balance and clarity. Embracing the full catastrophe of the human condition and facing what is perhaps most unwanted but nevertheless already present once it has occurred is part of waking up to our lives and to living the lives that are actually ours to live. In part, it involves refusing to let the dis-ease and the dukkha, however gross or however subtle, go unnoticed and unnamed. It involves being willing to turn towards and work with whatever arises in our experience, knowing or having faith that it is workable, especially if we're willing to do a certain kind of work ourselves, the work of awareness, which involves easing ourselves over and over again back into the present moment and all it has to offer when we learn and when we remember to rest in that awareness and draw upon its remarkable energies in the unfolding of our very lives, just as they are, just as we